I got a round of applause. That was, thank you very much for that. Are we ready to carry on? Okay, right, fine. Now I have my notes. Hello, I am Paul Johnston. My picture was up on there for a long time when you came in, and it's an old photo, but this is what I look like now. I'm the CTO of a company called Movivo. We're a startup. We've got 4 people. If you wanted a working title for this, it's anything but EC2. So you should get a bit of an idea of where we're going. What we do as a company, there's 4 of us. We bring free mobile internet and airtime to people in developing countries. It's a wonderfully worthy thing, but we are a commercial organization. We do a lot on AWS. I was brought on last year as the CTO, and I immediately made the decision that we were going to base everything on AWS Lambda. By the way, if anyone says, if I say the word serverless at any point in this talk, can you all go, hooray, very loudly, just to remind me that I'm not allowed to mention it, okay? So serverless. You are a very quiet audience. Basically, a little bit of background about me. I was a consultant CTO for a number of startups, around 15 startups over the last 6 or 7 years. Before that, I was a sysadmin in various organizations and a developer. And I think probably a lot like you in the room, I was the kind of person that spent their time architecting and developing solutions based on some kind of framework, a Django or a Rails or something even older. If you go back to Fusebox on Cold Fusion. Anyone? Hands up. Oh, one person in the room. Oh dear. That is old. But I've been using AWS since 2007, which is quite a long time. And I've been advocating it over a lot of other cloud solutions because of the extra services it provides, and I just prefer the way that they do things. So what I realized was that basically EC2 is a bit of a gateway drug. It's a gateway drug into the world of cloud. And so, as the previous guys have just said, a lot of people use EC2 with their, they stick their databases on an instance and then don't do anything about, redundancy or anything like that. And then it goes down, and then they go, well, we're on the cloud. Surely it should just work. And that doesn't happen anymore. So the gateway drugs, I realized that what we were doing was EC2 with security groups. And then all of a sudden, this was before RDS existed, of course. And then, we had S3, and then we got RDS, and then we basically could build these architectures that looked like basically we had a data center there. And so everyone was happy. But actually, most people, even now, still don't really go beyond the EC2, S3, RDS triumvirate. They don't really go beyond that. And they sometimes dip their toes into other things and use things like CloudWatch, but they don't really go beyond that. Just a quick spoiler, I do not work for Amazon. I am a CTO of a startup and here for my enjoyment. Whatever that might look like to you. But I don't work for Amazon, I just love AWS. So one of the things that I've been doing over the last few months is talking about serverless. Oh, who's listening? There's 8 of you, brilliant. And I've been going and doing talks on how you use AWS Lambda, on what you can do. And one of the things I've said over and over again that people seem to like, and I don't know why, is that frameworks make you lazy. Frameworks make you a lazy programmer. There's a lot in that, and I could unpack it, but essentially what it means is that you, instead of being a programmer, you become a framework programmer. And when you become a framework programmer, what happens is you forget how to actually do the coding in a normal way. So a quick example is that ORMs are one of the things that a lot of people use, obviously because they make data access very simple. But what happens is that you find that they go get one data set from over here, another data set from over here, and then join them in the code, at which point you turn around and go, are you using a relational database? Do you know how to use joins in SQL? And then you find out that they do, but they've just forgotten that that would have actually been a heck of a lot easier. And I think there's a certain amount of innovation that disappears when you start to use frameworks. I think you lose some of the complexity. The thing is, Frameworks are built for servers. They're built for a scenario where it goes into one place. That's why containers work so well now, because everyone's built for a thing. So when you build code, you build for a thing, and that thing is over here somewhere, and I build it here, and then I can put it over there, and it still works. That's the idea of what frameworks are there for. But when you do that, you don't necessarily get the benefits of something like AWS, which has services. They are actual services you can use. You've got all these other things that there's someone else's problem to run. It's really helpful, but often what happens is that you build your systems in a certain way. So kind of wanted to talk about not EC2. So where do I want to begin? So let's just kind of get a little bit of a base. Not every service is equal. Basically, if you think that, I don't know, CloudWatch is as good as EC2, then you're an idiot. You just have to realize that some things are useful a lot of the time, and other things are useful some of the time, and other things are useful in small small cases. It's just worth realizing that. Not everything works all the time. Everything is an API, obviously. It's service-oriented, but just not every service is right for every scenario. Just things to bear in mind as we're going through this. So, three-tier model. Everyone knows a three-tier model. It's very straightforward. You basically have your started off being apps. Well, it started off being websites, then it became apps, and then it was single-page applications. Then you've got your APIs. And then you've got a business logic data access layer of some description. So you've got your server application or some sort of framework, your Django or your Rails. And then you've got your data layer. And usually, the way that we do it, it's a relational database somewhere in the back end, because none of us use NoSQL. Primarily because we've never done it. But the point is, this is what we've always done. Doesn't mean it's the right way of doing it now, and it doesn't mean it's going to be the right way of doing it in the future. It's just what we've always done. So the biggest issue that we have with technology is that we tend to pick a stack, pick a technology, and we just stick with it, and we build a framework, and then we end up with a monolith. No, okay, fine. I couldn't think of anything else to put as a slide. Monolith as a word didn't really help. Basically, the big problem you have is that when you're building something that's big and scary and has 74 people working on it, and it turns out to be a thing, basically everything inside it can call everything else. So you can, if you wanted to, when you do this one thing, all of a sudden you can go and call this other function over here and do this other thing, and this function can call, and what you end up with is bits everywhere calling other bits everywhere else. That may be a good thing in your world. Actually, I look at it as much less maintainable than anything else. And so when you kind of look at the frameworks that we have to play with, the Djangos and the Rails and everything else, what happens is that someone builds a small thing, and then they build more things and more things, and usually that's authentication. Then you've got ORMs, and then you've got session management, and then you've got plugins and mix-ins and all of these other things that allow you to extend it. And then you build in admin scenarios, and then you just press a button and you've got a REST API, and it's really helpful. The thing is, half the time you have no idea what's actually going on. You just know that what comes out at the end is what you want, sort of. And then if you end up having to change anything, it turns into a nightmare. Just out of interest, how many of you remember having to code your own session management? There's about 10 people in the room. I'd just like to say that's a heck of a lot harder than it seems. And I remember having to do it over and over again. It was just the most nightmarish thing. Anyway, the point about monoliths is that they're built to be everything. They are done in that way. The frameworks that create the monoliths, they're built to be everything. But I have a problem with this, which is, what if there's an issue in one part of it? And we've had issues in monoliths, in frameworks before, such as storing the information for your password. The number of times I've heard, never use X framework because it doesn't hash your passwords correctly, and you can always do da 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 da, or something like that, or it's got keys in it somewhere. The point is that the frameworks have problems that we have to kind of work around, and often that's a frustrating thing. It's why you can get a lot of people using these frameworks, and then they end up doing lots of clever things. But it helps to have other people look at it, but sometimes actually that's a problem. So the way that I kind of look at this is that AWS is your foundation. It's a foundational thing for the monolith that will come eventually, or whatever it is, the building, the structure on top. And you get and a framework is the thing that would go on top when you build it as a and you build the monolith around it. So you end up with this thing that says that, AWS is your framework. Now, I have this thing that actually most people only think of AWS as EC2, and I think that's wrong. I think if you're using EC2, you could pretty much use any cloud host environment that just gives you a virtual server of some description, or a virtualized instance, or whatever, and you could just plonk the same thing on there, and you probably have roughly the same thing. You might have a bit of a problem with some, firewalls and various other bits and pieces. But I think if you're doing an AWS infrastructure, what you end up with is actually something very different, and I think it should be different. So some things that I love on AWS. How many of you use Elasticache? Nowhere near enough of you. It's just brilliant. You just turn it on, have a little cluster, and then you've got this brilliant, usually with memcached, key value store effectively. And essentially, what that means is that you don't have to run your memory on your EC2 instances or anywhere else. It's fantastic. Route 53 has already been mentioned. If you're not using it for DNS, the only scenario I can think of is that it's not your primary DNS, which would be an odd thing, because I think it's probably the best solution out there for most things, certainly within a startup environment. And S3 plus CloudFront is hilarious when I look at an EC2 instance that's actually serving static files. I mean, why would you do it? Why? And I've seen it so often that it just makes me want to tear my hair out. So kind of, let's kind of start piecing it back together. So I've kind of ripped apart the way that we do the way that most people do AWS. Now, let's kind of put it back together a little bit. I think that probably the key, although it sounds like a funny place to start, I think the key is probably Kinesis. Now, why is that? It's because it's event-based. And events are, I think, probably going to become far more important over the next 5 years in terms of technology and development, in the way that we approach the development of applications. A service-oriented architecture is kind of, your services and your messages somehow go backwards and forwards. Kinesis is the AWS message thing. And so you've kind of got to go, right, let's actually understand what's going on here. We're not just building something static that's going to be stuck onto a blob called an EC2 instance or even auto-scaling. It is that passing information around AWS means that you get the power of the information to the right bits, and you don't have to manage an EC2 instance running your bit. So I'm just saying that Kinesis is a really useful place to think about streams of information rather than I'm just going to hold it all in my, I'm going to be in charge of absolutely everything. Because, as I said earlier, within a framework or a monolith, what you end up with is your data flows going in between the way that you do things within your framework, and you're not making use of anything else, and you're going to have to maintain those flows of information. Whereas with something like Kinesis, you can chuck it in, and then you can consume it elsewhere. And you can consume it in the right way, and you know what you're doing, you know where it's gone and where it's going. So I think it's actually a very useful place to start, and I think it's also a very good place to think about stream processing for large quantities of information. If you're ever doing that kind of thing, it's certainly a very good place to start within AWS. One of the problems you have is understanding where things go. It's difficult to visualize, it's difficult to understand, it's difficult to kind of manage the way and think about things differently. But I think part of this is that if you're going to use AWS and the power of AWS, you've got to step out of the way of doing EC2 anyway, so you might as well start to learn some of this stuff. So very interesting. The previous talk actually talked a lot about identity, that word, and and authentication and federation and stuff like that, we have actually used Cognito very successfully, really successfully within our app. The advantage of Cognito is that it gives you your tokens. It gives you your token, your rolling token. It allows you to use your own login system if you need to, wherever it is, so it's very nice. So I think it's probably worth having a look. But what it does give you is an IAM role when you're unauthorized and an IAM role when you're authorized. And the problem is that most people, when they're using EC2, don't really have to touch IAM very much. So identity and access management, setting up your users and roles, and your policies and all of those kinds of things, you don't really have to understand it within just using EC2 and RDS. You kind of have to a point. But when you start to use Cognito, what happens is that you actually can start to control access to certain other resources, like a Lambda function or a DynamoDB table or various other bits and pieces, and it gives you the starting point to really think about those things in a different way. So you're taking away your authentication outside your monolith and you're putting it somewhere else. And Cognito works with your normal Google, Facebook, Twitter digits, which is very interesting. But it works in that way. So it gives you that option of having authentication that you don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about your users. I've lost mine. Thank you very much. Very unhelpful. So you don't have to worry about certain things. Interestingly, we don't even use it for authentication at the moment. We use it purely just to get an IAM user from the system. So we literally have an app. The app goes and gets a token, comes back, and that's an unauthenticated user within the application. And then we just have certain things that are open to that user. So I think it has value. Slight aside, EC2 instances, I think, are the most insecure part of AWS. When you're using AWS as a whole, basically people are stupid. AWS try and do everything secure by default, and then they give you the ability to make stupid decisions on an EC2 instance. So I think the more that we can take away the ability to make stupid decisions from people, I think you're onto a winner. By the way, I've just seen food. You haven't. So I'm going to keep this. I'm going to try and get through this a lot more quickly. So the next thing is DynamoDB. I love Dynamo. Who's used DynamoDB? Good. Who's actually used in production? 8. Okay. You should be using it in production, but not necessarily for the reasons that you think. Who doesn't know what DynamoDB is? Good. Right, fine. It's a document store. It's a bit like Mongo, but better, because somebody else manages it for you and it doesn't fall over. I think basically one of the things I like about it is the fact that actually somebody else manages it. It doesn't fall over. You don't have, with relational databases, it's lovely. You have these relations, you have normalization, you have all of these clever things, but you still have to manage it. Someone still has to, and then you've got downtime when you've got to make changes, and you've got to do all these other things. Even with RDS, when you're switching between two types, you'll have problems. DynamoDB, always up, always scalable. It scales to where you want it to be all the time. It's a really, really useful little tool. But the other thing about it, which is really helpful, who's used DynamoDB Triggers? 2 people. Okay, if there's one thing you take away from this talk, go and have a look up DynamoDB Triggers. Basically, what it allows you to do is on insert, update, delete of a piece of data into a DynamoDB table, you can trigger a Lambda function. That may not actually sound particularly interesting, but it's massively helpful. You can actually create queues by creating a single DynamoDB table, and when you put stuff into it, it automatically triggers logic. That's your stored procedures. You don't need to worry about having your databases, relational databases, doing your stored procedures. You can do them in your own code, and you can do it pretty immediately. It's very, very helpful. If you do anything else, DynamoDB and triggers, hugely helpful. Essentially, it's a special case of Kinesis, where when DynamoDB does something, it triggers a Kinesis stream to go and launch a Lambda function. This is why you kind of got to see Kinesis as the key to it all. EC2 is all wonderful and lovely. You can do what you want. It's like a little sand pit, or a sandbox, as they say in America. And it is like a little sand pit. You can do what you like. Go and have fun over there. That's absolutely fine. Build all the clever things. But actually, if you want to just create logic that somebody else manages, DynamoDB and Lambda. Pretty much the last slide. But essentially, Lambda is the secret sauce when we come down to it. It will become the holy grail of what we do with cloud over the next 5 years. I'm pretty certain of that, purely because we have seen that we have one EC2 instance. Do you know what that EC2 instance does? It's a proxy from HTTP to HTTPS. Yes, I did get that the right way around. We have a supplier who will not post to an HTTPS callback, because why would we want to be secure? So we have to produce them. We have to provide them with a proxy from HTTP to HTTPS. Don't ask me why. But essentially, that is the only EC2 instance we have, and that's 4 lines of Nginx configuration. And basically, when we come back to it, what we've got within Lambda is all of our logic, all of our business logic, and it's a small amount of logic. They're all stateless. The data is stored in DynamoDB. So we don't have to manage a framework. We don't have to manage security updates, except for our own, which mean that we have to keep an eye on what the code's doing. But most of the time, it does what we want. And when you add API Gateway in front of it, you can create API keys with API Gateway. So you can do stuff like have an API key and make sure it's only available to certain people. You can also use IAM with API Gateway. So you can basically allow it to only be available to certain types of user. So you've got these 2 things which allow you that you don't have to manage. And I'm all about low maintenance, all about it. I just don't want to maintain anything if I can at all avoid it. But it's also, the other part of it is that Lambda can be triggered from various different places. So not only can you trigger a Lambda function with a DynamoDB event, you can also trigger it from AWS IoT. You can also trigger it from CloudWatch. So you've got to log and then do stuff with it. It's really helpful. And then you've got Cognito. You can sync data from Cognito into it. You've got S3, and you've got Kinesis, and, of course, API Gateway. So you've got all these different ways that Lambda can be used. Essentially, what you're doing is connecting flows into a single location, and it's massively helpful. Makes life a heck of a lot easier. Of course, it has downsides, but it's running when you need it. It's an on-demand system. So if you really need to run something all the time, chuck an EC2 instance up. It's not a big deal. And the other part of Lambda, which I love, is that it scales horizontally out of the box. We have a system that I built before we hired anyone else that's had 500,000 users on it. That's not that many, but it's enough for me to be able to go, actually, I've just built this thing and I haven't had to touch it. Haven't had to worry about basically whether or not these users are going to be able to cope, and whether the system's going to be able to cope, or whether I'm going to auto-scale in any particular way. It just scales out of the box. So basically, when we're talking about moving away from the monolith, moving away from the framework, we're basically talking about events with Kinesis, identification with Cognito, data with DynamoDB, logic with Lambda, and API front-end with API Gateway. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about not EC2. This is what we do with AWS in our company. We're very keen on trying to keep EC2 out of it as much as possible, because it limits our exposure to basically stupid programming. And while we all think we're brilliant, pretty much we're not. We all make mistakes, and the less opportunity for mistakes that we can make, the better. So the way that we're approaching AWS is as a foundational infrastructure. It's the foundation. It's like a house. It's the foundation of a house. It's just a really clever foundation of a house. All the right things go in and out in the right kind of ways, and there's a lot of foundation if we need it. And basically, down with the monolith. There is a heck of a lot more to AWS than EC2. I think it's worth looking at. I think it's worth exploring. Thank you very much.
Do we have one question before we all get downstairs for food?
There is food downstairs. Good question.
Okay. One good question then. Any EC2 question, maybe? No? No?
No? Okay.
I think
Brilliant.
food
Thank you.
is coming. Thank you.